Well, those of you who have attended Building Nations in the past know that often the way we finish Building Nations is by hearing some of those who are in the positions of power, those who will make the decisions that will shape our futures, shape the infrastructure decisions that are made in the coming years. So, to wrap up Building Nations for 2023, it is my pleasure to host the annual Building Nations political panel. And I'm going to welcome out the panellists. You can cheer for them once they're all announced. From National, Chris Bishop. From the Greens, the Honourable Julianne Genter. From ACT, Simon Court. And Labour MP, Camilla Belich. Please welcome them. Take a seat, guys. Kia ora. Chris, I know you've been here for the last couple of days, so I'll start on the end and we can make our way down, and I'm going to throw the same question to all of you. How have the extreme weather events of this year changed the conversation, changed the priorities when it comes to New Zealand infrastructure?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's made a lot more people think about just the deficit that exists already in infrastructure. The quantum is the exact quantum is kind of irrelevant, anywhere between 160 $220 billion, which has been built up over many decades, and it's going to take time to address. And so it's just highlighted the need to address that. And the other thing I would say is building resilient communities. I think it's highlighted the need for building resilience into what we do.
Julianne?
Kia ora. Well, I hope that it means that people realise how serious the climate crisis is, and that we need to start right now running towards decarbonisation, like with everything that we do. And that's something that the Green Party has been saying for a couple of decades now. I remember in 2015 saying it to the listener, Guy Espiner, and saying that pretty much everything we have to do has to be aimed at enabling us to live good lives with a lot less carbon and living more in harmony with nature. And we have lots of opportunities to do that, but I'm sorry to say we have not really started on that journey yet, and we need to do it now. We're running out of time.
Do you get the sense that perhaps the public conversation or much of the political conversation has moved from mitigation, i.e. emissions reductions, into adaptation?
I think that there are some actors in the debate who want to go there, but the reality is adaptation means mitigation. If we don't reduce our emissions, we're not going to be able to adapt. So, we have to do both at the same time, and adaptation cannot mean rebuilding every road in the country that's going to get washed out by a major weather event. I mean, we need to move more people and goods with fewer vehicles, more energy efficiently, and that's a huge opportunity for New Zealand. It's an amazing opportunity. It's crazy that we have to campaign for these solutions because they benefit everyone so much in so many different ways.
Simon, how has this year changed things?
Well, I think what it's done is put a spotlight on problems that were already well understood, but that have not been a priority for this government. In 2020, Waka Kotahi commissioned a program resilience business case that identified 40 extreme risks around the state highway network, for example. And yet, in response to questions I put to the minister at the time, it turned out only 3 of these had any work going on to actually address these risks. And some of them, like Waiaweka Gorge State Highway 2, had recommended spending $100 million on rock bolting, not just to keep the road open and prevent slips, but so that a driver wasn't killed by falling rocks. And then there's the classic ones, like the Brynderwyns, or the Mangamoka Gorge State Highway 1, which is still closed years after a massive slip, cutting off that economic and social lifeline for the far north. ACT says it's completely unacceptable, and in light of the events, the storm events, we do need to refocus on the resilience of our infrastructure.
Camilla, how's it changed things?
Yeah, I think it's changed a lot of things. I live in Auckland, as I know some on the panel do as well, and it was really frightening being there during the floods, and also Cyclone Gabrielle was a huge impact on the regions that were affected there. So I think the main things that it's changed is it really affected the amount of money that the government had to spend on other projects, because we've committed $6 billion to building back better in those regions, building more resilient infrastructure. And I think also the public's perception of the reality of climate change has really been focused in those areas. I know from living in Auckland, people are aware that climate change is something that we are living with now, and also the importance of resilience and infrastructure has really focused the mind, I think, for people. So I just don't want to underplay how serious those were for the people who lived through them as well.
So Chris, yesterday Christopher Luxon came here and announced the 5-point infrastructure plan. How does as part of that 5-point plan, how does the 30-year infrastructure pipeline that National wants to introduce, how does that meaningfully differ from the infrastructure priority list?
So the way we envisage it happening is we get the Infrastructure Commission to go out there and independently say, here's what we should be doing as a country over the next 20 to 30 years. Here's what we see in terms of demand projections, forecast population growth. Here's what we need to be doing independently, provide that advice to Parliament. That's why Parliament unanimously, bipartisanly set up the Infrastructure Commission in the first place. And then within that, I think what you can do is have a priority list of projects, a little bit like some parts of Australia do, in which there's like a menu of options available. Because I hear people sometimes say, well, let's just depoliticise the whole thing. Infrastructure shouldn't be political. It always will be political by definition. Julianne and I fundamentally disagree about various aspects of transport policy, probably Simon as well. So it's always going to be political to some extent, but I think what you can do is have the best independent advice, and then politicians are going to campaign on particular priorities within that, and that's how we see the priority list operating.
But how is that different to the current setup and the work that the Infrastructure Commission is doing at the moment?
Well, I think if you said to people, is there a 30-year infrastructure plan now? The honest answer would be no. Is there a pipeline on the Infrastructure Commission website? Sort of. Does it capture?
But they're working on a priority list, right?
Well, sure. So in some cases we're building on what's already there, but we're talking about a genuine, comprehensive 30-year plan, or the best advice about what that should enable, and then let's get on with it and design our funding tools and our policies and our priorities as political parties, but also governments, to achieve that.
So I don't want to be too much of a mediator here, but when you say you can't take the politics out of that, that point of National's plan does sound very similar to work that is currently being done by the Infrastructure Commission, and I wonder if there's space there for the major parties at the very least to agree on some certainty around that pipeline. Camilla?
Yeah, I mean, we have heard the message that people want more bipartisan agreement, especially on infrastructure projects, and the reality is most of the projects that are initiated under one government probably won't be finished by the time that government comes out of power. So there does need to be a certain amount of bipartisanship in that. I mean, we did have a bipartisan housing accord that National came to us with, and we agreed, and that allowed for certainty for developers in housing. Unfortunately, they've walked back from that, but we are open to that suggestion. And I would say, in response to the question, how is it different? It's not, the plan that National has released is not different from what Labor's already doing, apart from probably the focus that we have on climate change and climate resilience.
Just can I just respond to that?
Yeah.
I mean, firstly, in terms of housing, our policy is better. And it actually picks up on, well, it is. And our policy is actually not
the
dissimilar.
best, though.
Our policy is not. Our policy is not actually too dissimilar to the stuff Phil Twyford used to talk about in 2017, smashing metropolitan urban limits, and then he got obsessed with Kiwi Build and all those ideas went out the window. But in actuality, there's quite a degree of consensus around that stuff. On the pipeline stuff, it does frustrate me because, and I feel like deja vu because we had the same argument last year on the same panel. But one of the first acts of the incoming government in 2018 was to smash the state highway budget. The net effect of that was to here we go. The net effect of that was to cancel or delay a bunch of really sensible projects, including Melling and My Patch, but the Tauranga Northern Link, which was out for procurement and about to be built, and it then got essentially cancelled. So, Labor sometimes talk about, let's build an infrastructure bipartisan pipeline and all that sort of nonsense. But they're the ones who cancelled a lot of projects in the first place.
I mean, the point is that all parties would have to come together, and I suppose when it comes to a negotiation, when it comes to no one is expecting that every single infrastructure project is going to be agreed upon by all parties. I think that's unrealistic.
Labor went through this period of where they said we're not going to build any new state highways.
Yeah.
Now they are, because political pressure got to them finally, and now they are. We just wasted 4 years while they backfilled it with the New Zealand Upgrade Program, and now all the projects are back on the books. Well, if they've been built in the first place and they'd kept to the pipeline, then the Tauranga Northern Link would be open by now, or almost certainly about to open.
Because Julianne,
Well, I think the issue is that those projects that were developed under the last National government we're not at all taking into account that we need to do something about climate change and that we have an opportunity to have a much more efficient transport system that moves more people and goods at lower cost. And so, of course, I think it was pretty sensible to come in and say, let's look at the projects that haven't been procured and say, what is the best way to solve our particular problems there? And instead of saying, we're just going to build a 4-lane divided highway everywhere, no matter how low the traffic volumes, no matter how high the cost, no matter how low the cost-benefit ratio, because the vast majority of the roads of national significance have BCRs under 1, and they do nothing. I mean, they're just not the best use of money for what we need to do now, and particularly to respond to climate change. So anyone standing up here saying that they care at all about responding to climate change, about getting a more productive transport system, and saying that they're going to promise huge amounts of money on new, expensive highways, it's just, fundamentally they're lying about one of those things, right?
Right.
Because we know we've got some of the highest VKT, highest personal car ownership in the world. That's a result of political choices made by local and central governments over decades, and it forces huge private costs onto New Zealanders to have to own more cars. I mean, thousands of dollars a year they're spending on cars that are sitting around parked 96% of the time. If there was ever an opportunity to give people more choice, to give them better choices, to get productivity gains, to use our land better in our cities, it's through a different approach to transport. And by the way, in other countries, it is depoliticized. The right-wing parties in Germany and in the Netherlands and everywhere else basically support Green Party transport policy because it makes economic sense and it works for people.
Yeah, well, Julianne, that's fine. We are going to build 4-lane high-quality expressways. And
So-
you don't like that, that's fine. We're going to have a debate about it.
What's really interesting about
We're going to have
this
an election.
is
So-
like, how are you going to pay for it? So, I mean, if you want to spend a ton of money on infrastructure, which you say you do, but you're not going to put up taxes, you're going to keep petrol taxes low, you say you want direct user charges for road use. If you had direct user charges for road use, there would not be the demand for the roads you want to build.
Okay, we're going to pick up on the funding point in just a minute, because that is really interesting, and that's been something that's been discussed here a lot over the last couple of days. I just want to round out that infrastructure pipeline thought, Simon, because I know you've got strong thoughts on this.
Yeah.
What do you see as being is there some space for compromise there? Is there some possibility we can have political parties from across the aisle agree on the certainty over a pipeline?
Well, there certainly is. But rather than a top-down approach where central government says, you get a light rail, you get a light rail, what we would say is, look, the regions, the cities have already done their spatial planning. They know where people are going to live. I've seen the maps. They're all coloured in. Auckland, another 900,000 people can come. But the problem is the infrastructure is not there to enable growth, and where people have moved in anticipation of being able to get around, either on a 4-lane highway or I'm mode agnostic. I'd love to be able to catch a train on some days. The infrastructure is not there. So what I would say is, look, local government, the regions need to propose the projects. That's where it starts. That's where you get political buy-in, because once they go on to a 30-year central government, local government agreement, it would be very, very difficult for future political parties to come along and saying, oh, by the way, we're cancelling a local infrastructure project. That would be politically toxic. We think we can have an enduring solution, but it starts with localism and actually asking communities what infrastructure they want and what they're prepared to pay for.
Let's talk about the funding. So over the last couple of days, there have been a lot of attention paid to the possibility of more private capital coming in to try and address New Zealand's infrastructure deficit. Given the size of the deficit at the moment, Camilla, is that something the government would support?
I think we would be open to more public-private partnerships, depending on the project, if it was right for the project and it made sense in the particular circumstances of it. We're obviously a bit wary about repeating mistakes of the past, learning from things like the Transmission Gully project, where we had a review that showed that it should have been, different decisions should have been made, it should have been more transparent. We wouldn't want to repeat those. We'd want to make sure that if there was a partnership, the taxpayer was getting good value for money, was a good investment, and the same, and the outcomes really would be the key, as well as making sure that was run properly. So I think that is something that we're open to, but it just depends on the particular circumstances of the project.
PPPs, Julianne?
Can we differentiate between funding and financing? Already we partner with the private sector to design, build, and maintain most of our infrastructure, for the most part, right? We don't have a Ministry of Works. The alliance model of procurement is a kind of public-private partnership. But if you're talking about private finance, we just have to be honest that that's really just borrowing at a higher interest rate. And, you know, there's no magic money. You know, wealthy investment funds from overseas are not going to come here and build us some infrastructure and not charge us for it. So the difficulty is most of the infrastructure we need to build now has really wide benefits, wide social, wide environmental benefits. And it makes economic sense to do it, but it's hard to extract a commercial return from that. And so it's probably not going to make sense. I can think of a few cases where maybe that sort of model would be beneficial, like allowing development rights over a train station, you know, something like that in an urban area. But it doesn't make sense, and this is what I said from 2013, and I appreciate some people in this room might have disagreed with me at that time, that a PPP for Transmission Gully, it doesn't make sense. It's just borrowing at a higher interest rate, and it ended up being much more complex to deliver because it involved a lot of adversarial lawyering on both sides. So it ends up costing us more. So I just, like the people coming in saying the answer is private capital, well, at some point you have to pay it back. And so at some point you have to look at our tax system. And at some point you have to say, if you want this level of infrastructure, then we need more progressive taxes, just like the countries that have the level of infrastructure that we're talking about.
Chris, what should be the role of private capital?
I think that if you just take a step back and say, got a big deficit, how are we going to address that? The Crown can't do it all by itself. Central government can't do it on its own.
Well, it could.
Well,
You just change your rules around borrowing. I mean, we have
Okay.
very low debt to GDP levels compared to other
I
countries.
gave you a fair run, so just let me have a crack. So Crown can't do it all on its own. Local government can't do it all on its own either. Actually, if you look at privately funded infrastructure, which we have a lot of in New Zealand, by the way, people forget about airports and telcos and gas and
Not this week, they
electricity
don't.
lines, and you know, it actually tends to be the highly performing stuff. But anyway, so we do need to use private capital. We've talked openly yesterday and generally about PPPs where they make sense, and Julianne's points are fair around litigation and around making sure the model's right, and the Transmission Gully review will be useful for that. And the Crown doesn't have much expertise in that, and we need to build that. So we've talked about that, but also things like tolls and value capture. And I actually think value capture is the kind of next frontier for that conversation around innovative funding and financing. And I agree with Julianne about development rights around train stations. Huge potential there. Huge potential for when we do a state highway, and ignore the, you know, just leave aside the fact that Julianne and I disagree about state highways, but, you know, someone builds a state highway into a greenfields area of land, and again, ignore the stuff around the battle between density and greenfields. There's a value there for the landowner.
Yeah.
It's publicly funded infrastructure. My simple starting point is, if we're going to spend some money and give you value, let's take some of that to help pay for the infrastructure in the first place. Simple proposition. Complicated in the execution,
Yeah.
but the principle, I think, hopefully we could all
Takes some
agree on.
changes to the Infrastructure Funding and Financing Act, right? But
Yeah, well, that's a
fundamentally,
form of
yeah.
value capture, and we need to be more, you know, there's a degree of sophistication that needs to develop in New Zealand around that, and
Yeah.
I think we're at the starting point, is my sense of it.
Simon, what do you think?
Well, it's all in here. ACT Solutions for Building New Zealand and Conserving Nature. 18 months of research went into this, including interviewing some of the people in this room. Basically, ACT believes we should bring back the hustle culture, where New Zealand had pioneer spirit. If you think about what we need a lot more of other people's money, and yes, we're going to have to pay it back. So we're not arguing with that, Julianne. But when we think about what should it be applied to, well, ACT doesn't think we should have a filter about what's a legitimate PPP, like Labor said, what's a legitimate ute. We actually think that any project that stacks up, whether it's vertical, whether it's social infrastructure, horizontal infrastructure, roads, whatever it is, if there's an opportunity to stack capital with private capital, government grants, property taxes, whatever they are, to add to and add to. If you think about the projects that we want to have to deliver better outcomes in our cities and in our regions, rather than deciding, well, crikey, we've only got this much money, like Dunedin Hospital, maybe we'll just cut off a surgical ward. ACT says you can have it all, and it's in here.
Hey, Julianne, is there any route that you think we can justify a 4-lane highway? Any new route?
Look, if you look at what the previous presentation from Infrastructure Australia, and you look at the 30-year infrastructure strategy, it says optimize what you have first. And so that means looking at our existing road network, which is, you know, it's not perfect. We've got to improve the safety of it. We could do a lot better with maintenance. We could, you know, improve the design. But rather than going and doing a parallel route new road, unless you've got real resilience reasons for doing that, how do we optimize the use of that road? And in most places, particularly in urban areas, it's functioning like a local road. Like the majority of the peak hour trips are commuter trips. So, put a busway on it. That's what we should have done with State Highway 16, previous national government. I know that you
I
admit
agree.
that was a mistake.
I agree with you. It was a big mistake. You're right about that.
We have a whole lot of infrastructure to catch up on, and probably the single biggest thing that's missing in transport anyway is passenger transport. And so I'd say CapEx, the priority should be for passenger transport that reduces the cost of moving around, is very efficient, is lower carbon, per person moved, and then see what you need to do after that. But do that first. And right now, that's just not happening. Let's Get Willie moving. The Second Harbor Crossing, they're doing additional lanes for cars in the middle of our cities, in the very place where public transport can be most effective at the highest possible cost,
Right.
rather than doing rapid transit first and then seeing, well, once we bring in congestion pricing, do we really
I'm
need those
glad you
extra
said
lanes?
that. Okay, that's my next question. Ross Copeland came out here yesterday from the Infrastructure Commission, came out on stage and said, my challenge to New Zealand's politicians is, can we please finally all publicly agree that it's time to introduce congestion charging? So I'm going to put that question to each of you now. Camilla, we'll start with you. Do you support congestion charging?
I think we're open to congestion charging.
Hang on, what does that mean?
Well, it's a bit above my pay grade to
Yeah,
make
yeah,
a
yeah,
commitment, but open to, I used to live in London. I've seen how congestion charging can really work to bring down traffic numbers, and I think it's something that is worth considering.
Simon.
Yeah, ACT proposes a wholesale shift to road pricing across the entire network using an electronic-based system similar to Singapore. It's no good saying we're just going to draw a ring around a city and we're going to let individual towns and cities take extra money off motorists. We have to think about this as a complete solution. One of the problems that we've had is that a whole lot of money's been taken from motorists, from truckies, put into the National Land Transport Fund that's been shandied off for a whole range of things that haven't delivered efficiency and safety. ACT says if you want to do congestion charging, make it all about road pricing, and then actually take that funding and give it back to the places where we can relieve congestion by building capacity or demand management and, of course, additional public transport.
But so in principle, yes.
Absolutely, 100%.
Right.
Yeah, I've good news. I guess Ross missed it, but we had a select committee inquiry where all of these parties agreed to, and supported
Yeah, in
completely
principle,
congestion pricing for Auckland. And I would say, this is something the Green Party has been talking about probably longer than every other party up here. So yeah, we're very supportive. But let's be real that once you start doing congestion pricing, you're going to have a lot more demand for active travel, e-bikes, public transport, and we need to get ahead of that investment, which is why we're saying invest in that as a priority in our urban areas. Bring in the congestion pricing, allow more homes where people want to live. Again, all consistent with what the Infrastructure Commission has said.
Chris?
Yeah, absolutely. I actually agree with what Simon says. We need proper road pricing, of which congestion pricing and dynamic pricing is part of that, time of use pricing, for example. But, we've got to, over time, we've got to move every car onto proper road pricing. I drive an EV. In fact, we're a 2 EV family. We pay nothing to use the roads. That is completely regressive. The way the system works is nuts. We need everyone.
Brought in by Simon Bridges.
Yeah, brought in by Nick Smith in 2009. Brought in by Nick Smith as a fillip to get people into EVs. But we're now at the point in which EV uptake is so big that
Thanks to the clean car discount.
Well, I knew you were going to say that. I just knew you were going to say that. Actually, the economics drive it already, and shouldn't get a subsidy for buying it.
But to your point,
Shouldn't get a subsidy for
Well,
buying
they
a Tesla.
weren't.
Yeah.
It wasn't happening until the clean car
Shouldn't get a
discount
subsidy for buying a Tesla. Anyway, the point is, the system is regressive. We need to make every car, every vehicle on the roads be around kilometres travelled, not fuel tax as a proxy
great.
for road usage.
This is great.
So what, what does more dynamic pricing look like in practice?
It means if you travel at a certain time of the day, you pay more to use the road.
That's right.
And in a perfect world, you'd open your smartphone and say, it's going to cost me $7 to go from Lower Hutt to Wellington if I leave at 7:20, but I'm guaranteed an 18-minute trip or whatever. If I leave a bit later, it's cheaper, but it takes me longer or whatever. Or the train down the road is, $4.50, and you make decisions, dynamic decisions around the way in which you travel.
Well, it goes to the
based
heart
on all
of
those
this.
things.
It goes to the heart of this point about actually making sure we are using the current infrastructure
Yes.
we have
Yes,
as efficiently as
absolutely.
possible. Yeah,
Which is the first point in the Infrastructure Commission draft strategy.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Use what we've got better.
So
Yes.
under a national,
Yes. We agree.
this
We
is it.
agree.
This is.
then
I don't
you
want to kill this buzz.
We agree.
But then you go around campaigning for
So
really expensive 4-lane highways everywhere,
Yes,
and
because-
it just doesn't make sense. Like it doesn't.
okay,
those two things don't go together.
Chris. Under a national government, when do we see dynamic pricing?
Well, I mean, it's going to take time to implement the system.
How long?
So I would
Access
like to,
5 years, we can do it.
Yeah.
Put me in charge.
okay. Maybe you'll be the Associate Transport Minister, who knows?
Boom.
No, that was a nice thing. That was a nice thing. It's going to take, look, I think everyone in the room, I mean, there are people in the room who would know more about that than I
Yeah.
would. I would like to do it as soon as feasibly possible, but the reality is we're looking at a, one to,
Multi-year
multi-year
response,
project
yeah.
to do it, right? It's a complicated thing.
Yeah.
Complicated to do. But we've got to do it.
So while we're at it, we probably should be paying people who are leaving the car at home and using bikes. And that happens in a lot of other countries because of the health benefits, the infrastructure benefits, the climate benefits. So you guys going to support that? Like if you have true cost pricing and we get benefits from people using active transport, can we pay them?
How would that work in practice?
Oh, don't, Chris, don't. Look, I tell you
Okay,
what,
no,
I tell you
well-
what, you've got the emissions trading scheme. So if there are real environmental benefits from leaving your car at home and using a bike, guess what? If you're paying for diesel or petrol under the emissions trading scheme, 20-odd cents a litre, $9, $10 a fill-up, and you leave your car at home and take your bike, you're already $9 or $10 a week ahead. And that's enough, isn't it?
So Simon, do you support the government getting out of the ETS and stop intervening and offering subsidies and discounts so that the market can actually operate in the freest way possible?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a few weeks ago, we saw the government offer New Zealand Steel $140 million to install an electric arc furnace. That's at the same time, there's a bill going through Select Committee that would reform the emissions-intensive, trade-exposed industries free allocation. I mean, the government could have waited about another 3 weeks to see the results of our Select Committee report, which would have said, you know what, we agree, there should be a rebaselining of heavy industry so that, they are actually going to pay for their emissions in the future and we don't have this huge burden of free allocations. That is all coming. You put a price on carbon and you stand back and you let market participants decide whether they're going to invest in decarbonisation or whether they're going to invest in mitigation. It's pretty simple.
Okay, I want to talk about labour shortages because obviously that's a massive concern, particularly for this sector. Are we doing enough, Camilla, to allow international talent to come to New Zealand and help us address the shortfall?
I think we're doing a lot, and you will see by the recent migration statistics how many more people are coming into the country. We have to be aware, though, that around the world there's very, very low levels of unemployment. So that's obviously going to affect, people's ability to be able to fill a lot of those positions. And I know that that's a frustration. I want to recognise that, and I know during COVID that was extremely difficult for a lot of different sectors. So I think we're seeing enough people come in terms of our ability, we're talking about infrastructure, we have to be able to cope with the influx of people, but it's certainly increased significantly, and I think people will probably be surprised at the high levels we now have.
Oh yeah, 100,000 annualised.
People,
it's massive.
Yeah, it is massive. So yes, I think we are doing as much as we can really within the constraints of the global environment.
Are we doing enough for this sector, Simon?
Well, I think what would really help the infrastructure sector is if there was a committed pipeline of work and if the sector had confidence. A few weeks ago, I attended an investor day where we were told that $170 billion was raised for infrastructure investments in 2022, but even though that company is New Zealand based, not $1 billion, not $100 million was going to come here. And that's because they have no confidence in investing in infrastructure here as a private participant. I just had a conversation in the foyer this morning when an old friend of mine said, our business is looking at the Australasian pipeline of work and they're saying it's not worth putting people into New Zealand. I think what we need to do is make it attractive, and as I suggested before, we start by having a pipeline of work that organisations know they should be gearing up for, and that rather than having teams sitting around trying to find places to put their chargeable hours at the end of every month, say the project that we were told would be in procurement is now in delivery and we're billing, and by the way, we're working on the next one. I think that's the way to bring skilled talent here, and that's going to take a little bit of time to turn around, but we're ready to do that.
Julianne?
Yeah, I mean, the Green Party has quite a open immigration policy. If there's one thing that I would emphasize, it's that we don't want to look at people just as economic units, and so we want a human rights-based approach to immigration. And my colleague Ricardo Menendez March has been doing a lot of really useful advocacy, and we don't think the current setup with immigration in New Zealand is really not ideal. But also we need to be training, and if we know that we have this opportunity to transition to a more people-friendly and more nature-friendly infrastructure system way of living and working here in New Zealand, then that's the pipeline, and we should be supporting people to train in those areas. I mean, young people want to be part of the solution. They want to work on that. But right now, they have to go into debt to study. They're living in almost like poverty-like conditions because we haven't fully addressed the housing crisis. There's a whole lot of stuff we need to do.
I'm an environmental engineer.
And I think that we need a comprehensive plan to support people to do this. And I guess what I would say to this audience is, while we might agree on some things up here on this stage, I would say that the National and ACT approach is not one of building a fairer and more inclusive society or taking action on climate change. I've yet to see the policies that will really deliver on that, and we have the opportunity to do that. We need cooperation like we have never had before to combat the climate crisis, and we have the ability to do that here in New Zealand, but we're not going to do it through tax cuts for the wealthy. We're not going to do it just by attracting private capital in, and we're not going to do it by building a lot of greenfield sprawl around motorways.
Can I just ask on that point, and I'll come to you in a second, Chris. Julian, do you think given the policy concessions that the Greens have or haven't necessarily won over the last 6 years, do you think that it perhaps is a time to be considering whether actually working with other parties might be a more effective way of outside of Labor, might be a more effective way of progressing your policy agenda?
Yeah, I think that our position is open to any party that's going to make meaningful progress on our social, environmental, and economic objectives. And I mean, I'm just being really real here. That's not with National. They've actively campaigned against most of the policies that are effective that we need to take, like the clean car discount, for example. We knew we needed that policy. It had a transformational impact on the cars that were being brought into the country, but they want to get rid of it. They've mainly campaigned against investment in rail and public transport. They've made some, around the edges a little bit, but I think if the National Party is willing to completely change its policy to be one that's evidence-based and do something about climate change and the environment, then we'll be open to working with them.
See, this, I don't even know where to start. I mean, this is, if you adopt that sort of attitude like that.
Your colleagues go out and campaign against social housing. They walked back on the MDRS. They go out and actively campaign against cycleways in urban areas.
I mean, yeah.
How am I supposed to work with that?
Okay, it sounds like perhaps the Green Party is not in a position to be working with National.
So the Greens are not interested in working with National, that's fine.
So back to that migration point.
Yeah.
Are we doing enough under the current migration settings to support this sector in speedily addressing that deficit?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of points. The first is that immigration policy under this government has been, with great respect, Camilla, all over the show. 2 years ago, Chris Farfel gave a speech in which he said we're going to do a big reset of immigration policy. We're going to constrain who can come here and how they can come here. And now, we've just done a complete 180, and those kind of wild U-turns, I think, are not helpful, even though we've landed in the right space. We are going to need talent, and we are going to need to attract talent to New Zealand. I also think we missed a trick during COVID, by the way, because the immigration in New Zealand, this is a technical point, but the immigration New Zealand computer systems are stuffed.
Yeah.
They're completely stuffed. And we really missed a trick during COVID when no one was coming of fixing that. And now the system's gearing up, and there wouldn't be an MP in the Parliament who doesn't have a migrant in their office every week complaining about various different elements of the system. So anyway, but I think the point Simon makes as well about the pipeline is really important. And, again, many people in this room have made this point to me multiple times over the last couple of years I've been the spokesperson. If you know that you've got projects, on the books that are coming, that are, next after the one you've done, you can gear up and you can, drive those efficiencies and keep the talent. And, that's been part of the problem over the last few years, is that pipeline's just oscillated massively, and it's been really problematic. So I think the pipeline is really part of that.
Have you got a pipeline of public transport and interregional passenger
I
rail
guess,
projects?
Look, Julianne, I know you sort of like to attack us. We started the City Rail Link, which you campaigned.
After I campaigned on it for 5 years. Yeah.
Yes, you're right. But we started the city. You started
good
the City
idea.
Rail Link. I have talked openly about rapid transit in Wellington and Auckland to drive higher public transport usage in our cities. I've talked openly about how the motorway network in Auckland, with the exception of the East-West Link, please don't interrupt because I know that enrages you. With the exception of the East-West Link, the motorway network in Auckland is complete. The next big challenges in Auckland and to some extent in Wellington are around driving, rail and bus patronage.
Yeah.
We don't actually fundamentally disagree on that. So you can kind of make it a attack, if you like.
We're fast running out of time. So given we do kind of agree on one thing, and that's congestion charging, and we all agree on the importance of certainty around the pipeline, we just don't necessarily agree on how we're going to get to certainty around the pipeline. I'm going to stick with congestion charging. If public transport isn't where it needs to be, and I think maybe we all agree on that as well, how do we ensure equitable outcomes for congestion pricing? If someone's working cleaning hotel rooms in Sky City but lives in Mangere, how do we ensure they're not getting punished for having that job? Let's go down. Each of you can answer that, and then we'll give you a quick time to wrap up. Chris?
Yeah, I mean, this is the great challenge of it, right? Which is the whole point of congestion pricing is that people face price signals. So at one level, it is impossible to solve the equity problem because it's by design in the system. You want people to face price signals that change behaviour. Now, it's not to say that within that there's a group of people for whom that is tough, and the policy outcome has to design around that. So you look at things around community service cards. I mean, we have existing welfare mechanisms around that.
Like direct payments, something
Possibly,
like that? Yeah.
possibly. That's why, greatest respect for Ross. He's pushing the boat out. He's doing his job. That's good. The actual design of congestion pricing, once you move from principle into practice, is tricky.
Yeah.
It is legitimately tricky, and that's part of the issue.
Julianne, do you have any thoughts on it?
Oh, well, you can't do two things with one policy. So I'd say fairer tax system, tax wealth, tax excess corporate profit, put more money into incomes, raise the minimum wage, make sure that people are earning a living wage and have affordable housing. And then we can have price signals for transport, and it's no problem. Because the issue is that some people are having to live in Mangere.
Are you saying you have to do all of that before you do pricing, or?
No, that's what we're proposing to do in the Greens, is have a fair tax system, fair society, close the income gap and improve quality of living. But the other thing is that in London and Stockholm, where they brought in congestion pricing, they did use the vast majority of the revenue raised for better public transport. They put in a lot of reclaimed road space to make it easier for people to walk and cycle. If we had more aggressive public housing being provided and affordable housing in urban areas, that will make it better for people too.
Simon?
Well, there's already a massive social inequity. Where I live in Auckland, you look at the northwest of Auckland, there's 30 or 40,000 homes destined to be built around Kumeu, Huapai, Riverhead, all around there. They're expected to rely on a 2-lane rural road, last upgraded in the 1980s, and there's not even a train service out to an existing train station in Kumeu. That's the inequity that people living in cities face now. So when Chris said the motorway network's finished, it is definitely not finished. We're going to fit another 900,000 people into Auckland between now and 2050. That's going to require all modes, and if congestion pricing or demand management and road pricing is a part of that, that's good. We've got to find other revenue sources, but we also need to solve the problems we've got right now.
Camilla?
I mean, in Auckland at the moment, it's already quite difficult to bring a car into the central city, and that's kind of what congestion charging recognises in a lot of the places where it's introduced. I think the point, though, is a really good one. We don't want to be in a situation where we have a congestion charging scheme that makes it more difficult for people to get to work, especially those on lower incomes. So I think it's a really important point. I can't design a perfect system for you now, but I think that it would have to be perhaps looking at a smaller area to start with, and it would have to go hand in hand with public transport options. And I think it probably wouldn't be feasible to introduce it in an area where there isn't better than usual accessibility to public transport.
4 months to the election. Let's wrap up with a 20-second spiel as to why your party is the party for infrastructure. Chris.
Infrastructure builds high-quality cities and drives economic growth. It's going to be an absolutely critical part of the next National-led government, and I can't wait to get started on the challenges facing our country.
Julianne.
Climate change and environmental issues are right there in our face, and all of you have friends in whānau, they have children. I know you care about future generations. We still have time to take action, and we can do it in a way that's going to benefit everyone, but we need your vote. The Greens need to be at the heart of the next government so we can implement more of the effective policy that's going to help us tackle this.
So.
Well, infrastructure will unlock social and economic progress, particularly in regions which have struggled up until now. It's all here. This is ACT's practical prescription for progress, ACT Solutions for building New Zealand and conserving nature. Thank you for your contribution, for those who have helped. And for those who haven't seen it yet, you can find it at act.org.nz. In October 25th, on October 14, we will have changed the government, and this is what ACT will be tabling at that first meeting.
And Camilla.
We have a plan to spend $71 billion on infrastructure in the next 5 years, which I think does make us a party that is really focused on infrastructure, but we also care about the outcomes of that and the type of infrastructure that we're building. So we don't want to just build infrastructure that fits a need now. We need to build resilient infrastructure that meets our needs in the future as well.
Thanks, guys. That was less contentious than last year. I think we almost even got close to consensus on a couple of points. Why don't you join me in thanking our political panel? Chris Bishop, Julianne Gender, Simon Court, Camilla Ballard. Come on, guys.